At the beginning of the story, we will be taken to Spain, precisely in the city of Madrid. Here, we are introduced to two policemen named Simon and Frank Vasseur, who are drunk together. Then they both discuss their superiors in the police force, that is, the police chief, who always playing with women and being arrogant. Simon and Frank hated the chief and hoped he would be transferred out of town. Soon after, Simon invited Frank to go home together because Simon's wife kept telling him to go home. But when Simon entered the car, Frank asked Simon to go first because he still had business to do. With his head still dizzy, Simon continued his car. And suddenly, Simon crashed. In the accident, 3 people had to become victims, while Simon still survived despite being injured quite badly. As a result of this, Simon had to be fired from the police and sentenced for 2 years because he had driven drunk until he killed 3 people. Long story short, 2 years later, Simon is now free from prison, and he works as a security guard at a factory. It was told that since Simon was imprisoned, his wife chose to divorce Simon, because she doesn't want to have an ex-prisoner husband. Simon was also forbidden to meet his son, even though Simon loved them both very much. In the end, Simon had to accept this harsh reality, and now he lives alone with his new job as a factory security guard. At one time, Simon saw his coworkers being bullied by senior security guards, but he prefers to keep quiet because he doesn't want to make trouble with anyone anymore. The scene moves to Frank, Simon's colleague who is still a policeman. Frank is currently handling the case of the illegal stuff distribution mafia that is increasingly prevalent in his city. In fact, almost every day there are always murder victims who are suspected of the mafia boss action. Soon after, Frank gave his report to the police chief. In the evening, Frank, who was single, hired a lady of the night. Apparently, Frank has often been accompanied by this woman when he is lonely. The next day shows Simon's ex-wife, Alice, watching a Matador show. There he was also accompanied by his son named Theo and also Alice's new boyfriend. One time, Theo, who had to pee, he went alone to the toilet. But unintentionally, Theo saw the mafia boss, Milan, finishing off someone. Suddenly, Theo quickly ran away, and the mafia boss immediately ordered his men to chase Theo. Fortunately, Theo could escape, then invites his mother to leave immediately. A few minutes later, we see Theo and Alice at the police station. Apparently, Alice chose to report everything that Theo had just seen to the police. Soon Simon came, because he got the news that Theo and Alice, his ex-wife, were at the police station. Then, Simon was told by Frank that Theo had just seen the mafia boss finishing off someone. Instantly, Simon realized that Theo was in danger, because he had become an eyewitness to the crime of the mafia boss. Quickly, Simon asked the police chief to provide more protection for his son, because the mafia boss could attack Theo and Alice any time. However, the police chief replied that Simon shouldn't worry too much, because hiring police services was quite expensive. Suddenly, Simon became angry, but fortunately Frank was able to break anger up Simon. Not long after, Simon walked out, because he must back to the factory where he worked. But accidentally, he saw 2 suspicious people who seemed to be going to harm Theo. Quickly, Simon ran towards Theo and Alice, who had just come out of the police station. Because there was also Frank and the other policeman, so they immediately chased the 2 people who want to attack Theo. Here, Frank could finish off one of the mafia members. Meanwhile, Theo, who was scared, ran into an empty warehouse. Then he kept followed by another member of the mafia. Theo was almost caught, but luckily Simon arrived on time and immediately beat one of the mobsters. Here, Simon could take down the person. Then came the police chief and others. The police chief immediately took the person to be taken to the hospital, then interrogated. Meanwhile, Frank suggested that Alice and Theo should first stay at Frank's house before they catch the mafia boss. In the end, Alice was agree with that suggestion, and Simon would also come with them, because Alice was very worried about Theo's safety. In the evening, we see Alice and Theo, who are now at Frank's house. Also seen Simon and Alice's new boyfriend, who come to guard there. Soon, Simon calmed Theo down by saying that all this would be fine. On the other hand, it shows Alice talking with her new boyfriend. Here, Alice asks the boyfriend to just leave, because Alice never really loved him. Hearing this happily, the new boyfriend will leave, because actually he doesn't love Alice either. The scene moved to Simon, who suddenly said goodbye to Frank, because he had to guard the night shift at his factory. Frank, who already understood his friend's character, decided to follow Simon from behind. Arriving at the factory, Simon only took all his weapons, because it turns out that he will be brutalized to finish off the mafia boss and his henchmen who are hunting Theo. When he wanted to leave, Simon crossed paths with his junior, who was always bullied with his battered face. This time Simon didn't just silent, and he quickly taught the bully a lesson. Simon hurried to leave, but when outside it turned out that Frank was waiting for Simon. Frank said that he would accompany Simon, because Frank already knew that Simon would be brutalized. But Simon didn't want to bother him and asked Frank to just go back home. However, Frank pulled a gun on Simon and said that they had been friends for more than 10 years. If Simon doesn't want to accept Frank's help, then it is better for them to die together. In the end, Simon was willing to accept Frank's help until they both went together to hunt down the mafia boss and his henchmen. The first step Simon and Frank take is to interrogate one of the mafia members who previously attacked Theo. When interrogated, at first the person didn't want to open his mouth, but after Simon threatened to poison his IV, the man was willing to tell everything. Apparently, they are the most powerful mafia in the city. For a long time, the mafia boss had always circulated illegal stuff and killed anyone who wouldn't obey his orders. At that time, the mafia boss wanted to kill someone who didn't want to buy his illegal stuff, but Theo accidentally saw the action. Therefore, the mafia boss ordered all his men to kill Theo, because he was considered to have been an eyewitness to his cruelty. Then Simon asked where the mafia boss's headquarters were now. The man replied that the mafia boss's headquarters were in one of the nightclubs in the middle of the city. Quickly, Simon and Frank went straight to the nightclub. Once there, Simon and Frank immediately went inside. But here, Frank met the woman who often accompanied him when he was lonely. It turns out that the woman is the mafia boss's subordinate. Quickly, the woman reports to the boss that there is a policeman in the club. As a result, the mafia boss instructed all his men to hunt down Frank and Simon, and a shootout ensued. Realizing that they were outnumbered, Frank and Simon decided to go outside. But here, they had to be chased by a car until a chase ensued. Not too long, Frank and Simon could get into a factory. But one member of the mafia still continues to chase them. At one point, Simon could finish off one of the mafia members. Then he asked Frank to escape before the mafia boss and others arrived. Not long after, the mafia boss came, and he was very surprised when he saw one of his members who had been killed by Simon earlier. Surprisingly, the person who was killed was the mafia boss' younger brother. Until now, the mafia boss has been increasingly vengeful towards Frank and Simon. An hour later shows Simon and Frank who have returned to their home. Here, Frank realizes that his dealings with the mafia boss will get bigger because the one Simon killed was Milan's younger brother. Frank also orders Simon to take Alice and Theo out of the city. That is because the conditions here are really not safe for them. The morning shows Frank who will take Simon, Alice, and Theo to the station. But unbeknownst to them, Milan, the mafia boss, was watching them from afar. It turns out that the mafia boss knows Frank's house because he was told by the women who often accompanies Frank when he is lonely. When Frank, Simon, and the others leave, Milan, the mafia boss, and his men immediately follow them from behind. A few minutes later, Frank and Simon are seen embracing, because now Simon will take Alice and Theo out of town for a long time. After everything was over, Frank entered his car to go home, but accidentally, he saw the mafia boss and his men entering the train that Simon, Theo, and Alice were there too. Quickly, Frank ran to catch the train, but unfortunately, the train had already departed. Frank also tried to call Simon's cell phone to tell him that the mafia boss and his henchmen were on the train, but the number couldn't be reached. As a result, Frank immediately chased the train using his car. On the other hand, it shows Simon who just realized that his train had been entered by Milan, the mafia boss, and his men. Quickly, Simon immediately became brutalized until there was a shootout on the train. As a result of the shootout, the train had to stop, because the machinist had been killed by a stray bullet. In the midst of the battle, Frank was seen who had caught up with the train. Then, immediately he went inside. Here, he had to deal directly with Milan, the mafia boss. In the end, Frank could take out the mafia boss. Then, he went to the front railroad car to save Simon, who was cornered by the mafia boss's right-hand man. In another railroad car, Alice and Theo were also seen being cornered by the mafia boss's men. But bravely, Theo immediately took the right precautions. Frank immediately woke Simon up to find Theo and Alice in another railroad car. But suddenly, they were ambushed by Milan, the mafia boss who wasn't dead yet. Seeing Frank being shot, Simon became angry and pushed the mafia boss off the train, until a fierce fight broke out on the train tracks. Determinedly, Simon invites the mafia boss to die together, but finally Simon could jump right before another train passes. Meanwhile, Milan, the mafia boss, had to die very badly. After that, it shows Frank who is dying, because he was shot by the mafia boss. Simon immediately went inside and hugged Frank, his best friend. Frank realized that his life wouldn't be long. He apologized to Simon, and Frank admitted that it was actually him, not Simon, who hit the 3 citizens to death. Frank should have been sentenced to 2 years and fired from the police because it was all his fault. Frank actually got into the car and was the one who driving. But after crashing the car and killing 3 people, Frank immediately got out and took advantage of Simon's drunken to make it seem as if Simon did it. All of this, Frank did it because to keep clear his own good name. Meanwhile, Simon must endure a 2-year prison sentence and work as a security guard. Hearing it all, it seemed that Simon was sincere and forgave all Frank's actions. Shortly thereafter, Frank was killed. 2 days after that, Simon, Theo, and Alice were seen attending Frank's funeral. It turns out that Alice has also now accepted Simon back as her husband because Simon has saved Theo and her life. Now, they can live in peace without having to move out of town because the mafia boss and all his henchmen have been successfully eliminated. After that, the movie ended.